The river breathed like a living thing beneath Riverrun's walls, a slow and whispering pulse that carried reed wisps and the last tatters of summer down among the pilings. From the high window of the solar, the braids of banners hung limply in the damp. 2 fish, a dire wolf, half a dozen lesser sigils that had the stillness of things held by a finger's width from falling. It was an hour of gray light. Lanterns clung to their own dim reflection in the glass panes, and the scent of wet wicker and old rushes filled the room. Robb stood with the map table under his hands, fingers spread where the green fork divided, and did not look at the ink but at the window. Gray wind lay stretched at his feet, long as a man and twice as heavy. The direwolf's head rested on his forepaws, and his yellow eyes watched the door. The door opened with a sound like a blade slipping free of a sheath. Catelyn stepped in, her hair braided back tight as a lady's, not as a mother who had wept and wept would wear it. She had wept, and still would, but grief had learned to hide in her like a river learns to run under ice. She held a raven's tube bound with sodden string. The reed smell was stronger near her. "From Seaguard," she said. "Lord Mallister?" Robb asked. The map under his hands became the sea in his mind, and the sea became black sails. Catelyn nodded, eyes unreadable. "He writes plain and proud, as Mallisters do, yet he says the letter within was carried by a man in salt-stiff leathers, a reaver with a prayer on his lips and no fear in him. Mallister swore him guessed right, then he swore him to leave unarmed. Both oaths held." Robb took the inner letter. It was sealed in hard brown wax pressed with a crude little crown, like something pinched from driftwood. Grey Wind's ears came forward as if he could smell the brine under the wax. "You know whose mark this is," Catelyn said. "I do." He broke the seal. The ink within sprawled like a captain's course set with a nail on a deck. The hand was not fair. The words were fair enough. "King in the North," it began without title or flattery. "Iron does not bend, but iron knows what it can hold, and what it cannot. Winter came early to your coast, and no man takes a pine with his hands. A sea bargain is never made on dry ground, yet the ground grows soft under us all. If you would talk, there is a way. If you would bleed again because your pride is a man, then stay. The sea will feed either way." A name and 3 marks followed. A kraken scratched like a child's drawing, a thumbprint of salt, and above that the words, "I am Asha of Pike, captain and daughter. Tell your river lord we come under his roof and with his bread." Robb read it twice. The first time the words were iron, the second time they were rope, and his thoughts hitched to them whether he wished or no. He looked up and saw the set of his mother's mouth, the set that said she had come to warn him from the river to the sea and back. "Salt and driftwood crowns and a reaver's pride," Catelyn said. "You know what your father thought of them. I know what they did to our people." "I sent Theon to them," Robb said. "That was my first thought. I have been thinking it every day since. If I do not think other thoughts soon, I will break with the thinking." Catelyn's hands clenched around the empty tube. "They took your brothers from us. They threw the North into ash and fear. They do not come with olive branches in their mouths. They come because they want something they cannot take. And what they want is never a thing lightly given." Grey Wind rose and moved to the window, put his paws on the sill, and breathed against the glass until a fog haloed his muzzle. Along the river, below the walls, the banners hung and water slept, and a few men smoked soggy pipe leaf against the rain. Somewhere, within the keep, a hammer rang on an anvil, the true bell of Riverrun. "A sea bargain is never made on dry ground," Robb repeated. "But a river bargain is made upon the stone. I'll ride to Seaguard. Jason Mallister will not stomach krakens in his hall." "Lord Mallister is my liegeman," Robb said quietly. "He will stomach what I bid him to, or he will stomach me." Catelyn's eyes softened a hair, though her mouth did not. "You have your father's way of standing when you say that. I used to think to myself that nothing would move him. Then I watched a king's fire at King's Landing, and nothing that came after was truly immovable." Robb placed his hands on her shoulders and kissed her cheek. The kiss tasted of the damp, and the salt on her skin might have been from a river or from tears. Would you have me turn away from any chance that keeps our men from dying and our banners from falling? I have too few of both. Rickard Karstark's sons are gone with their father's men and his bitter oaths. The phrase mutter my marriage at every fire. Edmure argues the red fork like he can bend it backward. The Lannisters burn grain for laughter. The only way forward is through iron. Perhaps iron will meet iron and dull one another. Perhaps iron will drink blood for the joy of it, Catelyn said in her mother voice. Be clever, Robb. Be wise. Be your father's son and your own. Do not be the boy who sent Theon to his father. He could not say the name without bone and grief around it. I will not. Take the blackfish with you, she added. And take men who will keep a bargain if one is made, and kill without flinching if it is offered up like a joke. I always take my uncle, Robb said. He is a better sword than my tongue. He looked down at the map and then away from it. Maps had begun to feel like lies the day the Raven came with fire for Winterfell. He left Grey Wind to pace the corridor while riders were called and harness leather woke on saddles. Brynden Tully already sat his horse by the gate when Robb came down, a lean hawk with weather in his bones, his cloak the color of a bruised storm. Edmure came to watch them go in, to argue about something, and then did not, and waved with stiff gallantry instead. Rain slicked the cobbles on the yard. The world felt as if it were waiting for a thing that had yet to be named. They rode under the low day toward the smell of salt. The road to Seagard ran like a scar along the riverlands, through fields of stubble where burnt stacks lay like black teeth. Villages came and villages went in a handful of bones and ash and the thin, stubborn curl of smoke from roofs patched against rain. Men turned their faces aside from a king's party rather than be seen with fear in their eyes. Some came out and cheered because they remembered a wolf's banner when they were boys. The rest kept their cheer because they had none left to lend. On the second day the sea appeared where land fell away to a long pale line. Seagard lay gray and tall, its watchtower a finger against the rain, and gulls spun and dipped in weather that wanted to be storm and could not bring itself to it. Lord Jason Mallister awaited them at the gate in pearl-colored mail, his white hair pommel-slick and trimmed as if he had the leisure of it. Beside him stood a knot of his sworn men whose faces had the tightness of men who have been asked to swallow a burr. Robb swung down, traded clasp for clasp, and noted what he knew he would. The pride was there, a bright thing as honed as the steel on Mallister's sword. They came under my roof indeed, Mallister said in the lesser hall. They came laughing. They were wet as otters and as sour as yesterday's ale. I told them where they were. The man who spoke for them said that stone is stone, and if it stops a wave today the wave will wear it tomorrow. Then he laughed at himself, which is more courtesy than I expected iron to give me. He spoke for them, Robb repeated. But who writes for them? Jason Mallister lifted a brow. A woman. That was my surprise. She did not insult me so far as to come herself into my hall. She is waiting along the strand where the watchtower casts its shadow at afternoon if there is sun to cast. The knights of Seagard do not forget Fair Isle. The knights of Seagard do not forget the sunset fires under their walls. But neither do the knights of Seagard forget a king's word. I will meet her on the sand, Robb said. I ask the use of your bread and salt now, and whatever boats you keep near, with oarmen who remember the river's moods. You ask as my king, Jason replied, and are owed for the debt of my birth and all my breaths since, though I never reckoned to owe such to a boy whose father I loved. You may have my boats and my men. Take care with my patience. Do you trust this? Brynden Tully asked, his voice low as they broke bread, the bread that bought a blade's length of peace between host and guest. I trust that if I do not walk to the shore, I will be standing in the same place when the snow comes, Robb said. The snow comes whether you walk or not, Brynden said, which was the sort of counsel the blackfish gave. A truth dressed in a smirk. They went to the strand when the tide had begun to frown along the edges of the piles. Wind tugged hair and banners. The watchtower bit a wedge out of cloud above them. She waited by the water like something thrown up by it. Lean, leather-wrapped, with a cloak that had been a sail once. A beard shadow lay along the jaw she did not have. Her cheekbones were cut sharp by weather. 2 Ironborn stood behind her, bareheaded, eyes dead at the corners. She wore a belt dagger with a worked kraken on the hilt, and her hair was bound with a bit of cord. She looked at Robb as men look at the horizon, measuring, not caring if it is offended by the measurement. "You are the wolf," she said without courtesy. "Not a boy after all, taller than your father. That was not one of the ways you raised yourself above him I thought to see." "You are Asher of Pike," Robb replied. "Not a man at all. That was one of the ways I thought to see you." Her mouth quirked. "Lister told me you would come with a wit sharpened by grief." Both cut deep. She took off one glove and held out her bare hand as if they were partners in a dance. Robb saw the salt in the lines of her palm. Not truly salt, only the scar of it. He unloved and clasped. The bones were small and strong. "We are each where we do not wish to be," Asha said. "That makes us kin of a kind. I will speak plain as iron. My father reached further than the sea could bear him. He took a prize and found sand in his hand. He can hold the stony shore if he puts all his men into the ice, and then he could not hold his own hall. The north is a poor land to keep. Those who know it keep it. Those who think they can hold it by strangling it find it hides its throat in the mire." "You have my attention," Robb said. "I would have had it if I had come burning," she countered, and then flicked eyes toward the water. "No banners. No horn. No blood upon the sand. I give you that. You are a king. You know what I want. Theon." The name was a stone he turned in his mouth. Asha did not blink. "He is what I want. He is my brother. He is a little to you. He is most to me. You will say he is not yours to give. You will say your man in the north took him. You will say he is a skin changed into a different man, and what would you do with such a skin if it came to you? I do not care. I want him. I would have him even if he were a bottle full of ashen teeth. You cannot make a bargain for him. He is off the board. So make a bargain for the board, wolf. Make it for what will matter after we are both drowned." "The board," Brynden cut in dryly. "You speak like a Syvas player." "I have stolen the board sometimes when the game went against me," Asha said. "Your tone says you have never. I make this plain. We will quit the north in truth. Deepwood Motte, Torrens Square, the Bear Island fishermen's huts we burned as if they were driftwood. Even Moat Cailin will bear its tea. Take and then close its mouth for a week. You send your Crannog men and your tattered banners through. After a week, it is our mouth again to bite at your southern neighbors. We will keep the stony shore for one winter's length as a place to mend our hulls and feed our men. We will not take a grain more inland. We will take no child to sell for salt wives. We will harry the western shore of the Lannisters until their lions eat each other. We will not set hook or knife on any Riverlander hall that flies your trout. And you will give us what your pride can bear to give. Which is, you will name my father what he names himself, and name yourself the same," Asha said. "King. King in the north, king of the winter, whatever the old trees call your bones. King for the Iron Islands, king of salt and rock, who wears a crown that keeps his brow from the rain. You will write it in your letters and say it from your mouth. You will take my hand and drink with me for it. You will tell Lister to stand his bright nights down when our keels strike the sunset foam for Lannisport. When winter comes we will leave your poor shore to its poor and go back to our poor stone. We will have what we came for, to take with our hands. We will not take from you. The river lords may turn their faces and spit, but they already do that when we drink their ale." Robb held very still. He heard his mother, and he heard the voice of the men at his council fires. Manderly, with the fat softness that hit a very sharp mind. Umbers who would name things loudly and break tanks over their heads. Glover with the quiet anger of a man whose hall was taken and his sister with it. Meege Mormont with eyes like pebbles in a cold stream. He heard Tywin Lannister laughing behind the river of his copper. He heard Walder Frey counting chairs on his fingers. "You ask me to give you my word upon a thing that will be called shame," he said. "And in return you will let me move my men where I need them, to the ground where they keep their houses and their graves. That is the true coin of it." "The true coin," Asha agreed. "If you like, Name it that I have won a prize with my tongue better than with my axe. I will sell you the lie of my father's victory if it buys me what I want. He will lick the lie because the taste is salt. He will make a speech from his tower that will ring along the cliffs and set the gulls in the air. He will call me loyal in the speech. I shall make a face and bow my head. You know fathers. Catelyn stepped forward now. She had stood with the Lannisters men, their mail bright with moisture. She did not look bright. She looked as if she had ground her teeth on sand until the enamel gave way and the grit remained. I am Catelyn Stark of House Tully, she said. I am the king's mother. I am a woman, as you are, and I tell you that all the women of the north have looked at the sea this last year as if it were a maw. You spoke of children, you said you would take none. I will have that turned into words that men can hold you to. I will have you bind it with whatever God will bind you. Asha's eyes went to her and for a heartbeat softened as much as sea eyes soften. Lady, let me say a hard thing plain. We have done the taking you speak of. I will not lie and say I did not. I will say I am not a butcher for the joy of it. I will bind myself on salt and iron and the drowned water that runs through my house that no child of the north or the trident is to be taken to the isles while this pact lives. If any of mine do it, I will cut him open and hang his guts on his own mast. You may tell your gods that. You swear that, Catelyn said. I swear it, Asha answered, and then, turning, she gestured to one of her men. He brought a small cask bound in tarred rope and broke its bung with his knife. The reek that loosed itself onto the wind was stronger than river, stronger than rain. Salt and fish and the coal of a boat fire. Another man brought forward a bundle wrapped in sailcloth. Asha opened it to show a loaf, rough and dark with sea berries baked into the crust. Bread and salt, Asha said. Not your kind. Ours. Under the tower, under the sky, with the sea at our shoulder. Will you take it, to keep my oath and yours unbroken while we stand within the shadow of this watch? Robb looked to Brynden. The Blackfish's face was stone. He gave a single nod. Robb took a piece of the bread, broke it, shook the salt from his fingers into his palm, touched it to his tongue, and then offered the crust to Asha. She bit in turn, barely, with a hint of contempt, or perhaps the sea has disdain in it that takes careless form. Catelyn set her jaw and did the same. Lannisters' men chose to stand away and watch with their hands on hilts. Then the pact is this, Robb said, and recited the bones of it in a voice that reached no further than the wind would carry, but far enough. The Ironborn withdraw their grips and hooks from every hall of the north, and open their hold on the moat to let the crannogmen pass my men and my banners. They keep the stony shore for a season only as a place to mend, and there will be no taking of children from any land under my protection. In return, the king in the north will not make war on the Iron Islands for the length of this pact, and will name Balon Greyjoy as king of salt and rock, writing letters and speaking words as befit. The Ironborn will harry the Lannister shore and leave the Riverlands alone. The Ironborn and the north will hold guest right where it is given and keep their steel out of that hall. If this pact is broken in blood, then blood is the price. No half measures. Does this speak plain? It does, and it speaks with a wolf's breath, Asha said. I would ask for one more token, for the drowned god loves a thing that has been pulled up from the bottom. Theon is not yours and is yours. If you lay hands on him, if you find him among your dead places, I would have him. Not dead and not flayed. I do not ask it because I think it easy to do. I ask it because I will know if you do not try. I cannot promise him, Robb said, but I can promise my trying, and more than trying. That is all I can promise. It will be enough, Asha said softly, too softly for the men behind her to hear. It must be. He was my boy once. He is nothing and everything now. She turned her face to the sea. The moat will be open to you for 1 week after you raise your hand 3 times from the crannog. Send your frog-eaters. They know the water and the mud. Of my father I will handle what I must. You will hear him howl from his tower about his will and his salt, and you will think him the storm. Do not be fooled. He can be steered when he believes he steers. They set their terms upon driftwood with blades and with blood drawn from their palms. It was not the way of the north to write laws on rotting wood, but the men who had come with Asha thrust the planks into the ground in the watchtower's shade, and the gulls called and the rain hissed on their faces. When it was done, Asha laughed once, short and sharp, like a wave slapping a boat, turned, and went to where a low longboat waited in the lee of rocks. Her men drew it into the thin surf with their hips. She pushed off with her foot and did not look back. Afterward, in the Mallister hall, men spoke. They always did. Some spat into rushes and called it honor taken behind a hedge. Some said a season's peace was a season's bread in bellies and a season's sowing done, and those would plant anyway with ash in their furrows. Jason Mallister drank his wine with stoic loathing and said, "If I am to watch reavers on my horizon, I will watch them under command at least." Catelyn sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on her son's face as if it were ashore too. The Blackfish waited until the third cup to lay his hand upon the map. "You can cross without the twins," he said in a measured tone. "I still say the phrase have less honor than a pike has hair. Even the river cannot wash insult from a fry. You can cross without them all the same. We have boats enough to ferry a portion of your host over at Fairmarket." The ford was lost to Tywin and found again by Edmure. He proved it could be held if they come in force. "If we ferry by night and by fog and cut rope fast, we can be over before any man who counts his coins at the twins has time to count his sons. Your foot will slog, but Howland Reed's people will show them how to slog without drowning." "Howland Reed," Robb repeated softly. The Cranaglord had not left his marsh in living memory, or so men said, and yet Ned Stark spoke his name as if it were a brother's. Robb had never looked in the frog-speckled face of the man who had pulled his father from a tower red with rubies and rain. There was a letter from Reed among those that came by Lord Manderly's couriers. He wrote in a hand that looked like moss, and he told me, "When the water hides the land remembers it has bones." I do not know what he meant, but I think perhaps you do. The Blackfish snorted. "It means he will float you where you need floating. I'll speak to Edmure, and he will be a trout for once and keep to his own water without wriggling free. You will leave a garrison here. Let Lannister come burn wheat and barns and feel himself brave. You will be in the neck before he hears the frogs." In the night, with rain tarrying in the gutters and the low spiral of wind moaning around stone, Catelyn came to Robb in the little chamber where he had taken his rest. Jane lay alone this fortnight at Riverrun under watchful eyes and kinder ones. The marriage had been made, and no unmaking it was to be had, and Catelyn had found, in the hollow curtained space where her grief and anger had lodged, a place for pragmatism to sit quietly and do its counting. She sat on his bed as she had when he was a child with a fever. He was not a child, and no fever could be sweat from this war. "You begin to be the man your father hoped for," she said quietly. "It does not make the road easier. It makes it harder. He told me once that the hardest thing he had ever done was to go to a man he hated and tell him what that man wished to hear, because in doing so he kept 10 boys from dying. He said he did not feel like a hero afterwards. He felt like a liar who had made his daughter despise him. Be ready for that." "I am not my father," Robb said. "No," she said, and touched his hair. "You are my son." The ferries slipped along the fog like fish through milt. Casks and crates were stacked to make a false shore and then slid away, leaving dark water where there had been floor. Men held their breath when the river touched their knees and were told with quiet curses to move their feet or they would be in to their necks the next step. Brynden Tully stood on the near bank and then the far bank and then the near again, somehow an old river god stamping from stone to stone, calling the rhythm that kept boats from colliding. Edmure came to see with eyes sunk and jaw set, threw a rope coil perfectly to a man who had nearly lost his grip, and then nodded once to Robb and went back to his fords like a soldier who has learned his lesson. The twins rose in the distance with their stubborn, foolish towers. Robb did not look at them long. He preferred the reeds. They went north, not in a shining host that turned the land to iron beneath their feet, but in a long, thin procession like threads drawn through a needle, and the needle passed through the neck. The world changed as men say it does not, all at once and without asking permission, at a line that was more a feeling than a mark. The air was green in the afternoon and black at night. The water lay where it wished in sloughs and ditches. The trees were not tall, but they were everywhere, and their roots crept out of the earth like the backs of sleeping eels. Frogs made a choir. Flies discovered any skin left bare, and then brought their cousins. It was miserable for men raised on stone quarries and full rivers and good road. It was home for a kind of man that Robb had never been and never would be. Howland Reed did not come himself. Robb had not expected him. Instead, there were men and women with net hands and arrow eyes who moved in boats that were not boats, but rafts and skins and things stitched from reeds. They called to each other in a half-language, and laughed softly when some poor boy from the rills put his foot down onto what he thought was land and found it the top of some old drowned hill. They smiled at Robb when he passed as if he were a boy, and he did not mind it. At night, fires appeared like orange pupils and then winked out. They left no track that anyone who did not belong to that place could have followed, and even the wolves seemed to pad more carefully on the spongy earth. The moat appeared first by smell. It had a smell like old iron kept wet and something bitter stuck under one's nails. The ruin lay where the causeway met the north itself, and its towers hunched like shoulders shrugged against wind. The first men had hewn it from their gods and their stubbornness. Every man in the host felt something under his sternum tighten when he saw it. Smoke feathered from a fire atop one of the low towers where some practical Ironborn had kept the rain off the cooks with some stolen beams. Crannogmen out front raised their arms in some pattern. 3 times the reeds bent. From the shadow of the gate, a shout answered in a language with too few vowels. Then there was a grinding of wood on stone and the mouth opened. It was not as simple as walking through. A pair of Ironborn, half naked and tattooed with black, came forward with hands lifted to show they were empty, and the frog-eaters met them with the same. Gifts were exchanged, salt fish and strange powders that Robb learned were good for fevers, and then the men from the islands melted back into their ancient perch among spear traps and holes that looked like puddles and were knives in disguise. The passage was narrow, and it felt like walking through a mouth that might decide to shut. Men breathed easier on the far side. Robb stopped once. He knelt and put his hand to the wet stone of the causeway. Felt like the palm of an old man. "For a week," Brynden murmured, reading his thought. "Then the teeth again." "Teeth," Robb said and stood. "Let them bite behind us. Let them bite Lannister. Let them bite Frey's heels if he strays too far north. I will have my house back." He found the north scarred and stubborn as a wounded bear. Barrowton had been stripped and left gnawing its own bones. But the Barrow men came when he sent the word. White Harbor sent word back on new parchment with seals as large as plates. Lord Wyman Manderley read like a merchant and swore like a soldier and promised bread and knives. The Rills sent riders with stories of Dreadfort men taking what they called taxes with meat hooks, and of a hooded man who smiled as he set barns alight. Girl children had vanished from a hamlet called Oakleaf. Men whispered about flayed skins seen drying on lines that should have been hung with grass. The Dreadfort's banners were out in the world more than at their walls. Robb did not march on it. He went around it, which no man in the north had ever done without looking over his shoulder. He wrote letters to Manderley and Hornwood and Bear Island, and words laid rails under his feet. He sent Galbart Glover and the Mormont women west toward Deepwood with a promise in his hand and anger like iron in theirs. He made for Winterfell. The castle was not a pile of ash. Not entirely. It had taken fire and held it and let it go with reluctance. Some walls stood as they had stood since men could count winters. Stones were scarred, and black licked along the corners of the towers like soot hands reaching. The great hall's roof was patched with tarps and thatches. There were weeds in the courtyards where there had been hall boys and song. The godswood was the same and not the same. Snow crunched under the trees where fire had not dared to come. The great heart tree watched them enter with its bleeding leaves shaking in a wind that did not reach the walls. Its face was calm in its red sorrow. Robb stood there alone for a time while his men went about the small business of filling a place with life. He put his hand against the weirwood and felt the bark's coolness soak into his palm and up to his shoulder, as if the tree were drinking him. He closed his eyes. He did not pray. The words for prayers all belonged to some other man, some other father. He breathed until the breath came easier. When he opened his eyes again, Catelyn was beside him, and he did not know how long she had been there. Her face was set with a kind of soft, grave strength he had never seen before and hoped to never see again. "This place remembers us," she said. "I remember this place," he said, and then laughter surprised him, sharp and short. In that order. That night they ate in a hall that smelled of smoke and singed stone and stew bubbling in a cauldron borrowed from the armory. They ate venison sent down from the wolfswood and bread baked on a newly mended table that had seen boys' hands and none so tall as Robb's. Men told each other stories that had walked north beside them, of the Ironborn at Moat Cailin who had watched the long columns pass and shouted something lewd, of crannogmen who had lured a band of Bolton men into a sinkhole and watched them drown one by one, of a turnip too hard to eat even after an hour in a pot. The smallness of the talk felt like mercy. Galbart Glover returned with news 2 days later, riding hard, his horse blown, his beard raw with wind and a thin line of joy cut across his generally grim face. "Deepwood is ours," he said, and men shouted, and then he raised his hand for stillness. "We did not take it by St. We took it by words. Asha Greyjoy met us on the track and put her axe into the ground. She asked for safe conduct out and a wagon of supplies and said she would leave the hall without touching a wooden spoon. We counted the spoons afterward out of habit. They had not taken a one. Meage Mormont said nothing. She guarded their backs as they went down the road, and some of our men cried that she had turned a bear's heart into a fish. She told them to hold their tongues and then made them eat the words, near enough. She quit the north," Brynden said, as if he were measuring a cloth and had found it a little shorter than promised, and yet sufficient to make something from. "I want to hear the whole of it," Robb said. "I want to hear the part that will not fit in your first breath." The deep relief that had built in his chest like a winter fire burned hotter, but he fed it carefully. He had learned that fire and war had more in common than men liked to admit. There was no word of Theon. Men called him a traitor and a boy and cursed his mother and his father, and some cursed Robb under breath for having sent him as if sending were as much a crime as taking. Robb did not curse. He kept whatever words could be kept inside him and took them out like coins when he must. He sent scouts to the Rills and the Barrowlands, men who were quiet and difficult to kill, and one he sent toward the Dreadfort itself, bearing a letter that was more sardonic than the paper deserved. Roose Bolton returned a note in the same cool hand he used for everything, saying that he would have gladly complied and would have gladly sent Theon Greyjoy to Winterfell under iron escort if he had held him. Alas, his bastard had taken the wretch for his own sport, and a bastard is a weeping wound that a father cannot stanch with letters. He sent a second letter with a man who had once hunted snowcats near the Shadow Tower and who had shoulders like the doors of an inn, and that man did not return. When a dog's skull came nailed to a tree at a crossroad with its nose pointing toward the Dreadfort, men read a message there whether one had been posted or not. On the third week after they had come home, a girl in ragged stag leather darkened the back way into Winterfell with 6 small figures behind her like shadows. She did not ask for bread. She asked to speak with a king. When she lifted her hood, her hair was cropped blunt as if with a knife meant for other work, and her mouth was set in a soldier's hard line. Asha stood in the rain that had just begun to fall, and whatever softness the first day at Seaguard had shown in her eyes was not there now. "I have your fancy boy," she said in Robb's hall, with no care given to ears. "He is what I said he would be. He is not a boy. He is not a man. He is shreds of a sail and the piece of a mast you can use if you do not need it to carry weight. I brought him because you tried, and because I am a liar and a thief and a good sister. I took him because that man with the pink smile sent a hunting party and they did not count the dog's back, and I found the missing dog whining in a hedge with a trap on its foot. You do not make a trap for a dog unless you are a poor hunter. Poor hunters lose their prey. The thing that came into the hall was stooped and thin. Hair tangled in tufts where it had been torn or cut without care. Hands scarred like a butcher's board. The eyes were the worst part, not because of what they held but for what they did not. He flinched from the fire and from grey wind and from his own name. It took the better part of an hour for them to persuade him down the length of the room and into the light enough to see Catelyn's face. She looked at him as if he were a grave. He looked at her as if she were a stranger who had died once, and then gotten up to ask him if there were any fish left on the line. "Theon," Robb said, in as steady a voice as he had ever used to command a shield wall. "Theon, do you hear me? It's Robb. It's me. Reek," he whispered, and then louder. "Reek, it rhymes with..." And he faltered and could not find the rest, as if something had stolen the wife of the rhyme and would not return her. Catelyn went to him with a cup of water and then set it down and stood with her fingers around the cup as if she had forgotten what it was for. "In this place you were a boy and a ward and my son's brother," she said, though she had not meant to say it, and there was a rustle in the hall like a wind moving through grass as men moved their feet and shifted their shoulders, not liking the taste of it. "You took my sons?" Her voice caught and she made herself go on. "You took what you had no right to take. This house is not a place you may sit as if nothing had happened. It can be a place where you live long enough to see the end of this war without losing your skin. That is what I will give you. For the mercy we show to those as broken as you are is what keeps us from becoming men who write their letters in flayed hides. Sit, eat, keep your head down. Say nothing that will make me have you put in a cell." Theon made a terrible sound, a choke or a laugh or a sob that had forgotten what shape it should take. He folded where he stood. Asha took his elbow and guided him to a bench near the back where men would not throw food and would not throw knives either because they were watched. Robb dismissed the hall with a clap of his hands and went to stand beside Asha in the shadow of the big chamber's pillar. The rain beat the patched roof with soft fists. "You could have taken him to Pike," he said. Asha's mouth tightened. "And watched him die under the eyes that turned his name to stone the day he wore feathers for a lord and thought it made him better than the sea? My father named him not son once. He would name him not man now. The Isles have no use for broken things. I am kinder than they are, and I am not kind." "You say you are a liar," he said. "Do not lie. About this, you risked much bringing him. What do you want from me for it?" She let out a breath through her teeth. "Your banner at the Kingsmoot when it comes. It will come. My father climbs stairs like a man counting coins. One day the last step will be under his foot and he will not know it. Our brother with the storm in his eye will be there to take the crown my father let roll between his feet. He will make great speeches about wings and wind and drown half the world to see what it looks like when it stops struggling. I am the other thing, the unglorious one, the one who makes pacts with wolves and watches the nets and counts the men to be sure they come back. I would be queen if they let me. They will not. Men who have never seen me sail will say my womb makes me soft. But if a wolf's howling could count for anything, you could make some of them listen. I cannot put a dire wolf on old Wyke," Robb said, "but I can write letters with my promises in them, and I can send men whose mouths carry weight among traders and captains. The North has no ships to speak of. White Harbor's cogs are for trade. Most of my oars are trees. Yet there is a thing I can give you that Euron cannot, something solid. I can say that if the islands have a ruler who remembers the weight of bread as well as the glory of salt, this pact remains past your father, because the pact we made was between us." She cocked her head. "You would give me that?" "I would," he said, "because I do not wish to fight your folk for years upon years, because I will have Lannisters enough and winter enough, and because I have looked at my mother and at Theon and at the hall where boys used to eat, and I am sick of seeing empty places at tables. If I can keep one table from having an empty place, I will do it." She gave a very small smile. It made her look more like a girl than a captain. "If we are lucky, one day we will be old and fat and our enemies will say our bellies ruined the world. I will send your letters to the men who smell the wind for us. When the Kingsmoot calls, maybe it calls to something besides the roar of a wave. You will write Balon's name as king until he falls. After that, you will write mine. It will amuse the priests." "How long can you hold your father to this?" Catelyn asked. She had come unheard or unremarked, which men who had lived through too many ambuscades find often happens with mothers. "As long as it pleases him to call me dutiful," Asha said dryly. "He likes it when I am. He does not notice the places where I am not. And if my brother with the blue lip comes to cast him down, he will be busy counting all the demons he wants. He will not count my pawns." The news of their pact went like a whisper and a shout through the north and then back down to the riverlands and across to the westerlands. It ran along men's tongues and sticked in their teeth. One man said, "The wolf is bedding a squid." Another said, "The wolf has learned to swim." In King's Landing, Tywin Lannister read it at his desk of dark wood and felt the weight of it like new coin dropped into a purse already heavy. He was a man that nothing shocked. The words did not shock him. They annoyed him because they were tidy and because someone else had written them. He sent letters of a different weight to Roose Bolton where he lay with his cold men in cold stone. He wrote, "The king in the north has retreated to lick wounds and will not be drawn forth unless we make him feel the fire at his skirts. The riverlands can be taken by the neck and shaken until they drop their trout onto our plates. The phrase would do the shaking for us if given a song and a reason to hate. I see already your cunning in how you place your knives. Place them once more in the bread." He never wrote the word wedding. He did not need to. The letter did not mention an Ironborn pact because he did not care to acknowledge a thing that limited his view of the board. His eyes were for the board in front of him. The sea was another man's problem. But men are not coins, and boards change when a wave runs across them. Walder Frey did not like the taste of being bypassed for the crossing. He had sharpened his insult to a point and kept it in his sleeve. He taught his sons the words he would say at a feast where meat steamed and harpers' hands grew tired and dancers grew dull and a king grew drunk. Instead he got rain on his towers and a river too heavy for him to throw stones at. He sent a message to Tywin saying, in a dozen different ultimatums dressed as courtesy, that he would be pleased to mend the insult. He would be pleased to hang the insult up in his hall and shoot it with arrows. He would be pleased to spit on it if his spit would stick. Tywin told him to wait and watch. Frey waited and watched and went to his bed with a mouth full of old teeth grinding on old grudges. And in the night a piece of him broke that he had not known how to call by a name. When the morning came, he looked at his hall and saw it bare of any king. He felt like an old man who had cleaned his house for a guest that never came and would never come, and for the first time Walder Frey hated himself almost as much as he hated any other man. Roose Bolton read Tywin's letter without changing his face. He had always understood the value of patience. He had made it the whole of his god. Yet he did not worship at other men's altars. He put the letter aside and went to his window and looked at the sky for weather. It would snow soon somewhere. He calculated time and distances and found that the numbers were set against him, because Robb Stark had gone home by a door that Roose had not expected to open, and doors once opened sometimes stay difficult to shut. Ramsay snow-seethed. He did not do arithmetic well. He set dogs on boys to see how they ran and threw a girl from a horse to watch the way her broken arm flopped while she screamed. When he heard the news that Asha had pulled his toy from under his nose, he screamed in a way that would have shamed a dog, and then laughed, and then took a man who had told him the news and peeled him in strips as if he were a pear. Roose watched this, and his face changed a little in the way it does when a cold man stands near a hearth. "Idiot," he said afterward, to himself more than to anyone, because his bastards were crazy weather, not men. Idiots make weather worse. Deepwood Motte had been a wound. Now it was a scar. Robb walked there with Meej Mormont and Robert Glover and looked at the places where iron had tried to make itself at home. "They mended their ships with our beaches," Meej observed. "They piss in our hearths. They keep their knives dry under our wives' skins. Now they are gone because a woman with a head as hard as a rock told them to go. I am not grateful, but I will not spit on a truth. They left my sister alive," Robert Glover said, quiet and shaking. "They left her tired. They left her angry. They left her with one ear for their jokes and one knife for their bellies. She cut back enough to keep something of herself. I owe them for that not being nothing. I owe them also for the haul they stole. I will carry both debts." "Carry them," Robb said. "Carry them and do not choke on them. Our war is not against those who keep their bargains. Our war is not for the pleasure of hearing our own bones crack when we lie down." News of the pact reached White Harbor, and Lord Wyman Manderley ate the words like a man at a feast. "If a thing saves me ships and gets wolves into their den, I will call it a saint," he told his son with his mouth full of pastry. "If it brings me profit besides, I will build it a temple and name it a god. He sent casks of good flour north and casks of poor wine that tasted better than water, and he sent, carefully bundled, a handful of smiths who could work iron and steel with a bit of art, because Winterfell's forge would be needed. He sent also a whisper into the dark that perhaps no one heard, because the dark is fuller of listening than men think. The whisper said, "When the hour comes, I will feed you more than fish. For now I feed you nothing that eats men." The days shortened. Snow began in earnest above Long Lake and along the high road, and then came down in fluttering white parchment in the places where men lived. Grey wind liked the snow. He lay in it and rolled and looked younger than any dog had ever been. The men who had worn their feet to blisters along the fens laughed for the first time without needing to look to their captains to see if laughter was permitted. Boys threw snow at each other and ducked, and one got a mouthful and choked and then laughed so hard tears froze in his eyebrows. Asha fetched food for the Ironborn who would hold the stony shore as promised. She did not take. She bargained. She sent letters in the round. Impatient hand Robb had come to know, saying, "We do not raid you this season because I say we do not. You do not raid us because you cannot. That is the difference between us." It made Maester Luwin's successor shake his head and chuckle, and Catelyn frown, and Robb smile with it hidden. He found, to his surprise, that he did not hate Asha. He liked her in a way he did not wish to examine too closely, which made him wary. Men have been led astray by liking that came dressed in guts and salt. He had Jane brought north when the snow made it safer, wrapped in furs and surrounded by men from 3 houses who were too stubborn to die. When she came into Winterfell's hall, some men rose and some did not. Catelyn stood. She stood because it was her duty to do so. Jane went to her and curtsied in the way girls curtsy when they have been taught to do it all their lives and never expected to do it where it mattered. "My lady," she said, voice trembling like a little bell. "I am sorry." She did not say for what. The list would have taken a notebook. Catelyn reached and put her hand on the girl's cheek and closed her eyes and stood with her there. 2 women bound by a boy's choices and a war's habit of breaking that runs in families. The black ravens flew even in snow, because words do not wait for weather. One of them carried word that a man had fallen from a bridge on Pike in a storm that left the sky like a scraped plate. Another carried the taste of brine further into the north. Euron had come home with gifts and madness and the kind of smile men do not put on unless they are about to leave you ruined and tell you they love you for it. A king smoot had been called. Asha's letters burned like small fires in a room with too much cold. She wrote, "If your wolf will howl, make him do it now. Tell the men who count fish that they can count wind instead, if they follow me. I can keep food in their huts. I cannot give them wings. If you howl, some will hear. Some. It need not be all. I do not need all. Send also words to lords who trade with the islands, because coin remembers and iron forgets. If the next king is chosen by men who like to see their wives drowned for glory, send me a knife better than the ones I have." "I will write," Robb said in Winterfell's hall, "but I will not send knives across half a continent. I owe my men my knives. You owe them also a world where they do not have to be used," Brynden Tully observed. "If a letter can do what a sword cannot, send it. There is a knight once told me the right words spoken at the right time can make a man take off his helm in the middle of a battle because he doubts which side he stands on. He is dead now. He took his helm off. But I think of his words sometimes." Robb wrote letters wrapped in wolf's den parchment and tied with Winterfell's rough twine. He wrote that Balon had been named king, and that the North had named him, that the North would not press its mossy spear into the Iron Islands if the Iron Islands did not press their salt rust into the North, that coal burned the same whether the hand that lie. It was wet with river or with sea, that the men who chose their ruler could choose a woman if they wanted to be warm in winter. He sent them by ways that were not routes but rumors, and one of them came to Old Wyke in a puff of wind that ruffled a priest's beard while he stood ankle-deep in surf and promised men salvation by drowning. The priest sneered at the wolf seal and held his breath and went under. The letter traveled along the beach and stuck under a rock and was read by a man who had once sold fish at Lordsport and now sold his knife to whoever paid more. He sold nothing that day. He pocketed the letter and would use it another. The Kingsmoot found Asha speaking like blade on stone. Euron spoke like a storm breaking a ship. The priests listened with half their heads and half their hearts and the half of their bellies that remembered hunger. In the end, sound carried further than thought. When the horns blew and the driftwood crown touched Euron's hair, Asha spat into the sea and did not pretend to weep. "Now you will have raids until your bones shine," she wrote on a scrap of sail dyed stale with squid ink. "He will go east to find wings. He will go south to find monsters. He will go anywhere but to the hearth. Keep your people from being plundered while he brags to the gulls. I will keep mine from starving while they wait for his gifts. When he fails, as he will fail, the isles will remember who kept them from freezing. For now, bolt your doors at night. Cannot leash a storm. I can tell you where it will blow." Men in the north did as people do when told a storm is coming. They looked up and made sure the shutters latched and then asked the sky to be gentle. Euron's longships struck the stepstones and the reach and the Mander slow. A few turned north smelling easier meat. Asha, with metal and words, kept most away from the truce's pale. One came too far and landed at the mouth of the White Knife, drunk on a captain's boldness. Wyman Manderly had them fed. Then he had them put in chains. Then he sent them back to Pike with a letter bound in silk, saying, "If the pact is to be broken, it will be at your cost, and the cost will be counted in heads and in bread. If you like numbers as I do, you will prefer bread." The men returned missing 2 thumbs each and each a tooth. Euron laughed when he saw them. He would have laughed if they had been heads in a sack, because Euron laughed for the joy of it, not because any particular thing was funny. In the Riverlands, without Robb's host to think of, Tywin pressed. He pressed like a commission left unpaid. He took towns by garrisons and by bribery and by sowing fear that grew like mildew. The Blackfish wrote in letters scant and dry that read like bone. He held what he could where he could. He burned the stores he could not carry. He did not throw men away to make a story that would be told around winter fires and then forgot. Edmure fought like a man who had learned there are only so many rivers and only so many banks and you cannot be everywhere at once. He lost and won and lost, as men do when the weight is heavier on one side of the board. Robb sent men south where he could. He sent Manderly's grain on barges up rivers that hadn't known wolves' banners in a year. He sent a bolt of good cloth to a widow who held a tower door against 5 men long enough for a messenger to ride out, and he wrote a letter to her son saying, "If I do not remember your mother, then I am not your king." He did not ride south himself. He could have. He did not. He had learned at Riverrun that he must choose where his feet would print the snow, and he chose his father's yard. When winter came fully, it came in great scoops thrown down by a careless hand. Men died because they had always died in winter. Men lived because they were smart and because the women were smarter. Grey wind ran with wolves whose packs had grown fat on careless travelers. In the long watch of night, Robb stood on Winterfell's walls with the cold burning his cheeks and thought of boys he had been and men he had become. Asha came once more that winter, under a sky so clear you could count stars and feel that counting would never end. She came with 3 men and a bag of spoiled fish because she liked to leave something for men to talk about. "You will marry again," she said in a bare room where the rushes crackled, because her tongue did not know the words other people used to wrap around knives. "You will do it to please your lords. They will pretend, as men do, that a marriage is a barricade they can build between what they want and what they fear. I am not asking anything from that. I am saying it because I like to watch you flinch less as the world throws things at you." "It is cold," he said, looking at her and seeing not a woman to marry but a captain to trust and a friend to listen to when she told lies that turned out to be truths. "You should come in summer when the apple trees bloom. Those blossoms are for girls and poets," she said and smiled the quick, hard smile that had first greeted him on the sand. "If there are any girls or poets left, do not let Euron tie you into his nets. He will cast them wide. He will talk of dragons and show you eyes. They will be a trick of light. If a dragon's shadow falls over your land one day, it will not be because a Greyjoy dragon has flown from Pike. It will be because the world has turned and you and I were too busy counting potatoes to look up. Count your potatoes. It is better to be a man with potatoes than a man with dreams. Dreams burn slower and hurt longer." She went as she had come. Grey Wind watched her go with his head tilted, and then he lay his muzzle on his paws again and sighed. Robb watched the door close behind her and wondered, as men wonder when they are tired and their breath makes small clouds that become nothing, if this were what peace felt like. Not a song, not a feast, but a truce with hunger and promises, that held so long as no one shouted. Spring did not come because it does not come when you ask it. In the deep freeze, word came of a king who had gone north of north with fire in his blood and a priestess whispering at his tallow ear. Stannis Baratheon and the Wall, and a winter the north had known in its bones even while its eyes looked across rivers at men in crimson cloaks. Robb sent men who knew the icy dirt under their nails and the smell of pine sap. He sent bread until his flour barrels spat dust and pity. He sent a letter to a bastard who was not his brother and who was and wrote, "I cannot come because a man cannot be everywhere his heart wants him to be, but I can send you what the heart hoards. I send you men because I trust you to put them where they ought to be, because you were raised by my father and I was too. If you swear to the night's watch, I am sworn back to you with it. When your watch ends, come home." The raven he sent with the letter was old and obstinate and was found 6 days later in a pie. Another letter went later. Perhaps it found the boy who was not a boy when it needed to. Catelyn put her hands on the stone of Winterfell's walls one night and said, not asking for answer, "If a world has a bottom, I have come near to it and kept walking." Robb stood beside her and said, because he wanted it to be true, "If it has a bottom, then it has a floor." And they stood there like that, two Starks looking into the cold with eyes that had more in them than emptiness. In the Riverlands, the Red Wedding did not happen because there was no wedding that mattered to make red. There were many smaller weddings and smaller reddenings. Men were killed in ones and twos. Men were betrayed for pots of stew. A man named Fry poisoned a cousin because he liked the cousin's wife. A horn blew at Stonehenge one morning and 5 knights rode away to sell their swords in the Reach because there was food there and not here. The songs missed these weddings. They always do. Tywin died in his bed a year later than he might have if the wedding had happened, of something like surprise. He died not with an arrow in him, but with a line on his face that no one had seen before, and all the gold in his hands could not buy the breath to smooth it. He did not die because Robb Stark did something. He did not die because of a pact with iron. Men die because someone has drawn a line and walked it too long, and sometimes because the sun has decided to redraw it for him. Men in the north heard of his death in the spring that was not spring and cheered a little and then went back to digging the earth clear of ice. Years moved, stubborn as oxen. Asha ruled her small kingdom with a dryness that made her men obey, because their bellies were full more often than not. Euron raved and captured cities and then lost them and told men he had never wanted them. The wars down south went on because wars down south go on. Sansa's name was written in a book by a man who liked books too much and thought liking a thing was the same as understanding it. Arya's name was spoken by men who would have done better to keep their mouths shut and their doors barred. Bran's name was not said in halls because the trees listened and did not like their own stories spoken by men. Rickon's name was said by a woman who had lost all her sons and did not know yet she still had one to lose. Winterfell held. Winterfell breathed. Men were born, and a midwife cut a cord with a knife that had once hung on Eddard Stark's belt. Men died, and a dead man's friend told a joke that made 2 other men laugh and another cry. No one wrote that down. One day in a grey that was like all the other greys, Robb stood again in the Godswood, and the weirwood's red leaves brushed his shoulder as if they had been a mother's hand. Snow fell as if it had all the time in the world. He thought of Asha at some shore, counting the men home and the men missing, and he wondered if this had been what he'd made, by taking bread and salt with a woman who smelled of kelp and steel. A stretch of years in which some named things happened and more unnamed things happened, and one could, if one tried, find in the whole of it more life than death. A crow called, harsh and bored, and flew up through the branches and into the world. Somewhere a boy was learning to lace his boots with fingers numb from the cold. Somewhere a woman was cursing the price of onions. Somewhere Euron Greyjoy told a story about a woman whose hair had turned to water when she kissed him, and somewhere Asha Greyjoy said to a man, "You're late." And the man grinned and said, "Only by a year." And she hit him on the shoulder hard enough to bruise love into the muscle. Robb turned his head and saw his mother watching him from beneath the bare limbs, and because he had learned not to lie to her when he could help it, he went to her and said, "It holds." Without saying what, she nodded, because she did not need to be told what, and answered, "It holds." And there in the Godswood, with the tree listening and the castle still standing and the air cold enough to bite, two people accepted that sometimes the thing you keep is not victory as songs sing it, not an ending in gold, but a peace made with those you can never love and held with words and winter and work. In the end, the North was the North, and the sea was the sea, and men were men besides with their hungers and their stubbornness and their small graces. If the wolf and the kraken did not lie in the sun together, they did not drown each other either. If the wolves learned a little of the tide, they learned too the patience of stones in a river. A boy became a king and then a man. A sister became a captain and then a story. The stories twisted around each other like ropes, and ropes, when pulled too hard, sometimes held. And the river kept breathing under the walls, a slow pulse that carried twig and leaf and little boats and sometimes men and summit. Im's words, out to a sea that was as merciless and as generous and as blind as any god. Snow settled on the branches with such delicacy that each twig wore its own crown. In the Godswood the red leaves were a stiff lace and the pond a black coin with frost around its rim like beard on a jaw. Theon stood near the tree as men stand near a door they have no right to open and do not know how to knock upon. He was dressed in clothes that fit, for there had been men who knew how to take measure without asking questions, and that small decency made him look more like a person and less like a wound. He kept his hands inside his sleeves. He did not shiver, though the cold bit like small teeth. He had learned a colder place. Catelyn came without sound. She had not meant to see him. She had not meant not to. She had been walking the circuit of stone and memory because the day was one that asked to be born on one's feet. When she saw him there by the heart tree, she did not call for guards, nor turn away. She went to stand where the weirwood's carved eyes could see them both. "You should not come here alone," she said, and knew as she said it that alone was not the right word, because the gods were never counted as company except by those who had no other. Theon glanced at her and then at the pool. "I am never alone," he said. "He is with me sometimes, even when he is not, and others put their faces on him and take them off again because it pleases them to know I flinch." Catelyn did not ask the name. She did not wish to give it the grace of her mouth. "There is a thing you have to say," she told him. "I can hear it in the way you make your words walk on crippled feet." He laughed once, a sound so dry it might have been a leaf. "I killed them," he said, and the words left his mouth and hung in the cold between them. "2 boys, not yours. Boys all the same. Mill boys. They smelled of straw and river mud. One had a laugh like a squeak. I thought, no, I did not think. I wanted to make a shape that looked like power and put it on my head. I burned them, and I told myself it was a mercy because we do not bury dead with faces on the Isles, and I thought a great many things, my lady, that turn into nothing when you look at them." Catelyn stood very still, as if the bark of the tree had taken her bones into it and steadied them. "I know," she said. She felt the words like a knife sliding along her ribs, not cutting, only touching to make her aware of her own skin. "I knew before you spoke. I have known for longer than it takes a winter to settle. I did not dare to know at first, and then Robb needed me to believe that hope was a thing we could eat like bread." She closed her eyes. Snow ticked against her lids. "But I am a mother. I counted their steps in the halls and on the stair for years. A mother knows when the feet she counts are not in the world any longer." "They are in the world," Theon whispered to the black water as if it were a mouth. Your boys, not the miller's boys. They were not in the world anymore when I finished with them. But your boys are, I think. The one with the eyes like flint went north with the big woman with the spear and the bad temper. The other, Rickon, he ran with a wildling girl who had more sense than any of us. They were ghosts in the walls, and then they were rabbits in the grass. I hunted them. I thought I did. He hunted them. The breath shook out of him. My lord, my lady, my king, my mother. The names I said into the dark. None of them answered. I called to him. He answered with a fist. I called to myself. There was not enough self left to call. Catelyn reached and put her hand against the weirwood's trunk because her knees were swamp under winter. The sap in the tree was slow. She felt the slowness come into her and steady the birds in her chest. You are telling me what you can. It may do harm. It may do good. It is the only way forward. I am not grateful to you. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and in the looking was the first trace of mercy he had seen on her face. I do not forgive you. I may not, in this life, but I will not have us be a house that flays men's tongues and writes letters in their blood. You will eat under our roof and sleep under watch and speak when spoken to and not speak when it will do no good. And you will tell my son all of this and more besides, every scrap that your memory has not chewed to rags. I will, Theon said, and the words came as a kind of slump. A man choosing the weight he would carry because all the other weights had carried him. Robb came to the Godswood as men come when they are called by no horn and yet hear the call. He had a wolf in his shadow. Grey Wind sat down at the edge of the pool with a huff and looked from man to man with the patience of beasts who have been made to wait for the meat they deserve. Theon did not throw himself at Robb's feet. He did not kneel. Kneeling would have been a lie his knees could not tell. He stood and spoke, and the words were the same as he had given Catelyn, but they sounded different in the king's hearing as everything did. Those boys, Robb said when he had done, and his voice was steady in a way that made Theon sweat. Those boys had a mother and a father and a sister perhaps, and a dog perhaps, and a small box where they kept whatever small things children keep. I will have their names when I can. I will find the man who let 2 sons go and did not follow because a reaver held a rope with one end looped about his own wife's neck. I will pay his debt. I will pay yours to him, and yours to the north besides, in the coin that keeps men living through a winter, grain and warmth and the knowledge that his children did not go nameless under snow. And you will live long enough to see those names written in a book. Theon nodded and his head moved stiffly, as if the muscles in his neck were a rope that had been frozen. And bent and frozen again. I thought you would kill me. I may, Robb said honestly, and Grey Wind's ear flicked as if the words had made a sound men could not hear. Not today. Today you are worth more than your death would be. Tomorrow maybe also. The day after we shall see. Do not mistake the space between an axe's fall and the headache it leaves for a pardon. Theon's mouth twitched. I am learning to count smaller things than pardons. Count this, Robb said. You know the Dreadfort. You know the dogs. You know the way a man like Ramsay Snow guards his pleasures. I will take him. I do not say I will take Roose first. Roose is a poison that kills slowly if you let it, and sometimes it kills faster when you try to cut it out. Ramsay is a tooth. Teeth can be pulled. It will bleed, Theon said, not as caution but as observation. Everything bleeds, Robb said. I am not afraid of blood. I am tired of it. That is different. He sent for Manderly's man, and for Robert Glover, and for Meege Mormont, and for a woman from the Rills named Ragna who had once tracked a bear for 2 days through drifts and brought it down with a spear made of a door hinge. He sent for 2 Crannogmen who had come north with messages and laughter like bubbling mud. He sent for Maester Donnell, who had learned to keep his hands steady while men groaned and bit down on leather. They came to the solar with their wet cloaks steaming, and Catelyn came too because she refused to be put in rooms while men decided things, even when those men were her own. They spoke over a map that had been mended with boiled parchment and beeswax. Robert Glover put his finger where the weeping water bent like a man bending his back to a load. If you go straight at them, the snow will chew your men's feet. That is besides the bolts and the traps and the pits they will have dressed with brush. The Dreadfort never looked like much because it does not care to look. Cares to be. How many? Meege Mormont asked, impatient as always with talk that went in circles. Enough to make it ugly, Ragna said. Not enough to make it easy. That is how the Boltons do. They hoard until it is just enough. The sun takes his pleasures beyond the walls, one of the Crannogmen observed. He had reed bits in his hair and a smile that came and went. He grows fat on noise. A fat man will come to the smell of fear like a gray fly comes to meat. Theon's hands were fists inside his sleeves. He did not look up as he said, "He likes to send a pair ahead to light. He comes last. He does not come to fires. He sends other men. He comes to screams. He does not hear them as other men do. He hears them as music makes him feel." Maester Donnell made a face and then smoothed it away as if ashamed to let such a thing touch it for long. Catelyn's mouth thinned. Robb was very still. "Then we will make screams," he said. "Not from our own. From a thing he cannot resist. A hunt. We will let him think he has sniffed a trail and found a rabbit that is only a rabbit. He will run dogs. He will run men. Then we will shut the door on the kennel and see if dogs howl when they understand they have been locked in with a wolf." "You want to take him alive," Robert Glover said. It was not a question. It was a dislike. "I want to take him so alive that he knows what it is to hear a door close and not be able to open it," Robb said softly. Theon lifted his head and looked at the man he had almost killed with betrayal and, in a different life, would have died for without thinking, and did not say thank you because the words would have broken his teeth with the saying. "He'll bite the inside of his cheek when he is afraid," he said. "He'll chew it and spit blood and smile at you like it is wine. He does that because it pleases him to make his fear into your discomfort. If he cannot bite, he will try to choke on his own tongue just to make you put your fingers in his mouth." "Don't." "We will not," Brynden Tully put in from the doorway where he had been leaning, silent until he was not. "We will bind his hands with a care as if he were a bride and the ribbon delicate. We will keep him somewhere that does not smell like men. He will think that a kindness and it will not be. Stannis Baratheon is on the move," Maester Donnell said suddenly and at odds with the talk of screams and knots and snow. He had a raven's copy in his hand, tied with a blue thread as if men had chosen to color dignity so. "He writes to announce his victory at the Blackwater. He does not announce it because there was none. He writes anyway because the ink is cheaper than truth. But the hand below tells me all I need. Cold, prickly, miserable. He is coming down from the wall before the snows close roads. He means to take the north for himself. If he comes with bread and fire," Meej said, "I will give him my ear. If he comes with parchment, I will give him my fist." "He is a king by his own making," Brynden said. "Like all of us. He will require that you kneel, Robb, and you will tell him to warm his hands over your fire while you tell him a story about wolves that have knelt in the north. It will be a short story." Robb rubbed his thumb along the smoothed edge of the map. "I will speak to him. I will not be his enemy if I can help it. I will not be his subject. If he is wise, he will count which weighs more in winter, pride or bread. If he is not wise, then he is himself." Stannis came under a sky made of iron late that fortnight, at a place where the King's Road passed a stand of stubborn pines. He had fewer men than he liked to show, and more than any man had a right to lead that far north without losing. They had the look of a rope that had been well used and hung to dry and might yet hold a ship when needed. With him came men who did not look as if they cared whether the sun rose. A priest with hair black as bitumen and eyes like ink spilt on paper. A smuggler with fingers that wanted to count. Ropes and barrels and not rings. A handful of Southron knights whose wincing at the cold came from pride more than bones. And with him, trailing like a banner no man could seize, came the grim purpose of a man who had chosen to be right even if the world bled him for it. They met in a plain of wind and white. Robb, he came with a respect that made men who had not known him choose to make room near a fire. He had honest hands. Wyman Manderly's man recognized him and grinned. The grin of a man who likes a story he can eat. "I am not here to spy," Davos told Robb when the two of them stepped aside, out where snow creaked like leather, "though I spy on everything I can, as a habit that has kept me alive when better men died. I am here to do what I do. Carry words, carry promises, carry things that do not want to be carried. Men say you gave bread and salt to Ironborn and did not draw a knife under the table. I have been a smuggler long enough to know that a man who can sit with a raider and eat can do other hard things while holding his face straight. I held my face because the men at table were mine," Robb said, "and because I had watched the river and learned there are times when you let the water go where it will." Davos nodded. "There is a boy you would want found," he said, "and an island most men won't sail for because they like their bones where they are. If a thing like that ever needs doing, you will remember a man with a hand full of stubs who can find a way in waters that think themselves pathless." Robb felt the arrow of it and did not reach for it too fast. "If I had such a boy and such an island and such a need," he said, "I would think as you say. I would speak also to a lord who likes counting as much as eating." His eyes flicked to the Manderly man. "If such a lord heard a rumor that my brother lived and hid his head among rocks and cannibals, he would perhaps smile with all his chins and call for more lamprey." "The same lord does that if he stubs a toe," Davos said, and his mouth tugged into a smile that sat oddly on that plain, trustworthy face. "Send me if sending there is to be. I do a thing because it is right these days. I used to do things because I was hungry. The difference is smaller than men tell you." "I will send a word," Robb said. "No man will know the name written on it except the men who need to. You will be one. The other will be a woman who can keep her breath shallow and not cough when she lies in the dark for an hour waiting for footfalls to pass. I have a handful of such women in my house. It is a thing we learned the hard way. They parted with the quiet complicity that men who are not friends and will never be exactly sometimes find in each other, though the world calls them enemies." Stannis marched on, winter pinching at his braid. He did not look back at the wolf banners. He did not need to. He would come again. He liked to come at a place until it moved. The trap for Ramsay took shape not on maps but in the layering of small things that together made a snare. A woman bent her back as if she were carrying a heavy bundle and left prints that could be read by men who wanted to. A boy with a hair-lipped grin walked a path that looked foolish because it would take too long when there was a shorter route in. Therefore was the path a frightened boy takes. A pile of wood that had been stacked in haste like a bad-sewn shirt loomed where a pair of cutthroats would see it and think they had found the place to smoke someone out, not knowing that the smoke would pour in the wrong direction when lit. A dog's whine carried on air in the pattern of a lure sounded by someone who had learned to draw more out than he put in. Howland Reed's people laid reeds in old water and knew enough to make currents men could not see. Men who had been poachers before they were soldiers lay in snow with mouths full of cloth, so their breath wouldn't fog, and watched for the shape of a man with a smile like a slit. Ramsay came as a fire comes when it sees tinder. He came because fear had been made, and because he had trained himself to smell it like bread. The first pair went ahead and did what men do when they are made to do the same trick too many times. They made it sloppy. They were taken in a silence that made their eyes bulge. One died without noise at all, because the Crannogman's hand knew where to cut. The other was left in a little burrow with snow pulled over him like a blanket and a gag in his mouth. His breaths came slow after an hour and slower after 2. When someone found him in the morning, he had knitted himself together with the cold into something that could not speak, and he never did again. Ramsay followed with dogs and 5 men and a laugh when one of the dogs barked at a shadow. He did not ride. The snow was too deep to make riding look like dominance, and he did not like to be made to look smaller by nature. He walked with a swagger that said the world should move out of his path and had better, and if it failed to, he would make it. He had a string of human teeth tied at his wrist like a charm. He put his head down to sniff sometimes, a habit men said he had learned from the bitches he bred and broke. When the boy with the hairlip stumbled on a root, he grinned and made a little sound in his throat, and the men with him grinned also, because that is what men do when their master shows his teeth. They came to the place where the light of damp wood smoldered and a hovel showed its ribs. A dog went in and came out yelping because something had pricked its nose. Ramsay laughed and cuffed it and sent another to teach it bravery. He gave orders without looking at the men he gave them to. He walked toward the smoke without care, because fear is sometimes more carelessness than anything else. When the snow under his foot gave a little as if it were a chest settling and then shifted, he cursed and stepped back. That was when the reeds on either side of the path came alive and the rope concealed in them rose like snakes, and the boy who had been a boy 1,000 years ago set his foot on a plank and sent a net up and over the man with the teeth bracelet. Ramsay went down more easily than men had expected. He let his weight go as if he had been waiting all his life for the moment a net would hold him and he could stop holding himself up. He smiled like a boy in mischief. He spat blood at one of the men who had grabbed his ankles and cackled when it struck the man's cheek. "Soft hands," he said, and wriggled his head as if he had been taught by eels. Then he stilled and stared at the shape coming out of that hovel with its smoke and its stench of old ashes and wet wool. Theon came into the gray light like a memory that had decided to put on flesh again. He had a chain in his hand. It was not attached to anything. He did not need it to be. He had a look on his face that Ramsay recognized from whatever part of his mind tracked such things. Not fear, not rage, not triumph. Terrible patience. "Reek," Ramsay crooned, as if greeting a beloved dog who had come back from an afternoon's wandering. Filth on its fur and joy in its eyes. "My sweet. I missed." Theon hit him then. He did not use the chain. He used his fist and it made a meaty sound, and he did it again. And then he stopped and said in a voice that sounded like he had borrowed it from somewhere that taught better men lessons, "Do not speak my name." He swallowed. "Do not unmake me. You will not unmake me again." They wrapped Ramsay careful as the Blackfish had described and dragged him through snow that turned him red where knots pinched skin. He sang at first. He sang a nonsense song about rabbits that have their ears braided together and boys who eat the braids like ropes of candy. He stopped singing eventually. When the cold got into his lungs, he started to cough, and then he did not stop. That noise was what the crannogmen wanted. It covered the crossing of a stream and the small cries a man makes when the water goes over his boot and creeps up his trouser leg and meets a patch of skin he has been ignoring. They did not take him to Winterfell. That had been discussed and set aside as something that would poison stone. They took him to a hunting lodge that belonged to no one now except snow and the memory of happy autumns. There they put him in a stable with no hay and hung a lantern where it would not warm him. They bound him to a post in such a way that he could make himself more comfortable if he resisted the desire to struggle. He resisted once and cried out and then stopped resisting. When Robb came into the stable, it smelled of old horse and cold iron. Grey Wind went to the far stall and tore at rotten straw until dust rose, agitated by things not seen. Ramsay's head came up as if pulled by strings when he heard boots on dirt, because a man like that cannot help but meet eyes. His lips were bloody from his own chewing. He smiled anyway. "You," he said. "I wondered when I would." "You wondered nothing," Robb said evenly. "You do not have wonder left in you. It is a thing that dies when you feed it what you feed yourself." Ramsay's eyes flickered to Theon, who stood with his hands at his sides like a man awaiting a verdict he had been ling himself for a long time already. "Reek," he said softly. "Will you bring me a cup? I am very thirsty. I will share it with you. You like my spit." Theon did not move. Robb walked forward until he was near enough to smell the man's stink. "You will be tried," he said. "Not because I owe you justice. I owe justice to the men who will sit and listen and to the women who will hear about it sitting in their kitchens with the door shut and their hands red from water. They will know we kept the law. They will know that when we kill it is not because killing pleases us. You will put me in a room with candles and law and men who use big words," Ramsay sneered, and there was relief in it because he had expected something else. "You will dress my killing up like a feast. That will make you feel better when you lick your fingers after." "If you are guilty," Robb said. "If." Ramsay laughed, and the laugh broke into a cough, and the cough turned to a string of spit that hung and swung. "If," he gasped when he could make breath again, and then, still laughing, he sang, "Reek, reek, it rhymes with—" Theon stepped forward, and that was the only warning. He took the string of spit with his hand and wiped it very carefully on the wood of the post as if cleaning some precious blade. He said, with a terrifying mildness, "It rhymes with weak," and the smile died on Ramsay's face for the first time as if someone had put a thumb on its neck and pressed. They tried him the next day in a hall that had seen happier noises. They sat him on a stool because chairs looked like respect. Robb took the high place not because he wanted it but because men looked to the place as much as to the face. Catelyn sat near, with a face as grave as stone over a riverbed. Brynden stood at his shoulder like the living moral of a story. Theon stood far back where he could see and be seen and yet not cast a shadow on anything he should not. They called witnesses and there were too many. A boy spoke whose father had disappeared after being summoned to the Dreadfort with a letter that said the taxes in grain were behind and this would be smoothed by discussion. The boy's hands shook as he spoke of the flayed skin tacked up on a gate and how he had known his father by a mole he had hidden next to his ribs that his mother had once kissed when they were young. A woman spoke who had been kept in a dark room and told that if she screamed she would make the dogs excited and then she'd have no quiet at all. She said the worst part had been the small kindness offered with the cruelty, that there had been a man who brought her water and called her my lady and wept when he shut the door. A keeper of dogs spoke with a voice that sounded like he had eaten nothing but leather. He had seen things he could not forget, and the only way he had learned to hold them was to speak the names of the dogs who had been made to do it. He spoke the names softly. The hall went silent around him like cloth laid over a cage. Theon spoke, and when he spoke of things he had done, he did not say the name he had been forced to say. He said his own with effort every time. Ramsay smiled through most of it. He looked bored through some of it. Once he yawned. When he was asked if he had anything to say for himself, he said, "I am a bastard and I am too good at what I do to hide it. If I had been born with a name that fit on a lord's letter, I would be hunted less and praised more. That is the only difference between you and me. If it makes you feel better to say you are better than me, do it. Men like to feel better. It keeps their s." He looked at Catelyn and amended with a smirk. "It keeps their bellies full." No one hit him. That was the only thing that surprised him. No one hit him even when hitting would have felt like quenching a thirst. Robb pronounced him guilty, because there is a way in which a man guilty of one crime has already pronounced himself guilty of all he needs. He sentenced him to die. He named the offense, all the long words and the simple ones, because naming is how you bind a thing. He told the hall he would take the sword himself, because a Stark does that, because his father had taught him and his father had been right, because if anyone was going to feel the way a man's neck moves under a blade this day, it would be the one with the crown on his hair. Afterward the snow outside looked wrong in the eyes of men who had watched, as if it ought to have been red and was not. Ramsay's head rolled into a sack as heads have always rolled. Those gathered did not cheer, not in the way men sometimes cheer as relief. The quiet they made was a better thing than cheering, and heavier. Robb wiped the sword and remembered, unbidden, the first time he had lifted one. He thought of Bran staring with wide eyes that had not understood yet, and of Arya with her fierce little jaw clenched, and of Sansa closing her eyes because she had thought it polite to look away and had felt shame that she wanted to. He stood breathing as the small puffs of cloud left him and became nothing on air. Roose Bolton did not come to parley or to rage. He wrote a letter, cold and careful, that said he had no bastard, that a man by that name had been disowned and therefore any acts committed were committed by no one whose stain or virtue could touch House Bolton. It was a neat letter. It laid itself down on the table of Winterfell as if to say, "I am furniture. You cannot be angry at a chair." Catelyn picked it up and put it back down. Brynden said a word that got him a sharp look from a septa who happened to be within earshot. Robb smiled without humor. "Then the man is free to stand before us and clear the dignity of his house," he said. "Let us invite him to do so, and if he does not, let us understand that this is how a man confesses in script." Roose did not come. He withdrew to the Dreadfort with the men who belonged to him by terror and kinship. The North watched, and the watching itself changed something. Fear does that when it turns its head. Men who had been willing to be counted as Boltons because life is easier when you let the greater man's shadow cover you came to Winterfell instead, and said in mumbled voices that perhaps they'd sworn faster than wisdom demanded. Lady Barbary Dustin rode to Winterfell with a retinue like a knife wrapped in velvet and laughed in Robb's hall and told Catelyn to her face that she had never liked Starks, not even the ones with quiet eyes, but that she liked the Boltons less when they pretended to be other than what they were. "A flayed man is honest," she said in a tone that made it a parody of a motto and a truth both. "This one writes letters that use too many words when one short word is better. I mistrust a man who cannot say what he is." They planned for the Dreadfort in earnest now. War had a way of being the same even when snow made it a different animal. They set caches of food along the line men would take, because men died more often for lack of bread than for lack of courage. They sent jesters of a kind. Men who walked to halls with jokes and news and women's names and came out with gossip that had teeth in it. The jester at Barrowton had a scar long as his forearm and knew which of Lady Dustin's grooms put their coins into Bolton pockets on market day. In White Harbor, Wyman Manderley balanced ovens and armies with a joy he had not felt since he had been a boy and snuck sausages out of the kitchen. He fed Stannis just enough to see where the king would put his boot next, and he fed Robb more because Robb's boots were already familiar with his floors. He sent a barge that sank and another that did not, and a letter to Robb that said, "They wish to see you fail. We will bake their wishes into pies." Davos came back alone one late day with the look of a man who has held his breath for an hour at a time and learned to breathe again. He went first to Manderley because this was the natural path his feet had learned, and then to Winterfell with a dog's stubbornness. He had a boy's cap in his hand. It was made of poor felt. It had a scrap of blue thread sewn clumsy along the edge. It smelled faintly of smoke and something like apples. "Rickon?" Robb asked even before Davos had found how to put his words into order, and the question was the nakedness of a man who has been king too long and forgets sometimes to have a tone. "Alive," Davos said simply, "and wild as a cat. He looks like your father about the eyes and like no one when he bares his teeth. The woman with him is a bear and a mother and a ghost all in one. She threw a spear at me the first time I spoke. The second time she fed me. The third time she told me to run as the men with bones in their hair came down. There are places in the world are not like places. This is one. He is there. He will not stay if staying is death. He will not come if coming is death. He will do the thing between." Catelyn took the cap from his hands as if it were a child. She held it and looked at it with a love she had not permitted herself in years, because permitting love had hurt too much. "I will never know why the gods hide my children in places with snow and knives," she said softly. "But if they mean to show them to me again, I will not turn my face away. I told him," Davos said with a clumsy dignity that made his voice thick, "that his brother was waiting for him. He looked at me like I had told him spring is a thing a man can eat. Those are the eyes of a boy who has not had many gifts and would not know what to do with them. I will go again. I will go until I can't. The sea owes me a thing. It has not paid it yet." Robb clasped his forearm. "I owe you more than I can name," he said. "I will not try to pay in words. Tell me what you need." "A boat that does not look like it was paid for by a king, and a crew that knows how to say nothing," Davos said. "And a man with a knife who has made peace with the idea he will use it on something that looks like a man and is not. That will do." The campaign against the Dreadfort moved with a slowness that would have maddened younger Robb and only tested older Robb. He learned how to wait in a way that did not sour in the stomach. He coordinated with Stannis when the game board allowed it. Stannis took Carhold with a grim cheerlessness after unmasking Arnulf Karstark's treachery, and the old bear's cousin of the Rills sent carts of salted meat to Stannis's camps because she had decided two different kinds of stubbornness could share a pot if someone with a spoon stood between them. Robb's men took smaller holds that had fed the Dreadfort and turned their casks. A kettle that does not boil sends a different sort of smoke. The Boltons, who liked control, began to look for it and not find it where it had always been, in fear and in hunger. Roose did not lose composure. Men like him do not. But his letters got more precise and therefore more brittle. Snow came hard that year and stayed, and men marched with scarves around their faces and reins wrapped in rag to keep fingers. One night the aurora walked across the sky in green like fish under ice. Brynden Tully stood with his head tipped back, and for once he had no story to compare it to. "It does not mean anything," he said gruffly. "It only means the world keeps its own counsel." Robb stood beside him and watched for as long as he could without feeling the aching between his shoulders become more than ache. He did not think anything meant anything that night beyond men's feet and bread. They made a killing ground 20 miles from the Dreadfort where a road narrowed between a rise of rock and a stand of birch. The Boltons sent out a supply cart guarded by a scant handful. It was their habit because they counted the north as theirs. Crannog men were in the birches. A handful of Mormont archers perched like owls on the rock. The cart rolled. A wheel popped its pin where someone had whittled the pin to weakness and hidden it. The men cursed and knelt in the snow to fix what they thought the cold had cracked. The arrows dropped with small puffs where they bit. They took men, Not because they needed prisoners, but because prisoners talk in directions you do not foresee. One told them that Roose had sent quietly for help from the Freys. Fry answered slowly with a letter that had more conditions than roads in a maze. Another said there was a rumor in the halls that Ramsay had been taken by a ghost and then returned to be killed by a king. Half of those who spoke this said it proudly as if it meant Roose had been wronged, and half said it soft as if they were glad a nightmare had ended and did not wish to share their joy with the wrong ears. A third man told them that the lower storerooms had weevils. That was the best news of all. They ringed the dread fort in a cordon that cut off nothing visible and everything that mattered. Bread came less sweet. Salt came slower. Men began to sell stories for bacon. Roose's dire measures, a flaying there, a noose here, had less effect when men were hungry. There were no great battles because winter does not give them up easily. There were 1,000 small ones, and the sum of them was a great thing. Honor came as a surprise sometimes in that winter. One afternoon a Fry bride rode into the ring under a white cloth and asked leave to pass. She had the pinched mouth of a woman who has thought about herself more than anyone else for too long and learned belatedly to think of others. "There are children inside the Dreadfort who are not Boltons," she said. "2 of them are mine. If they die, I will be sad. That is a truth. If you open a way for them to leave, I will pull them through it with my teeth. You will do what you like with their father." "Names," Midge Mormont snapped. Not because she was cruel, but because names were the way you reached a hand through the fog and laid it on the right shoulder. The woman gave them, and Midge wrote them down with a bit of charcoal on her palm and blew on them as if warmth would make them more real. They did what they could, and some children came and some did not, which is the way of winter and of war. The Fry woman left with 2 and cried without making a sound and did not thank anyone, because thanks were too small for what had been done and not done. The day the Dreadfort fell was a day that should have been like any other. The sky low, the air full of ice dust. It began with a kitchen boy slipping on a stair in the keep, breaking the skin off his shin and cursing. Then the cook slapped him for the word and he cried, and his tears were the first water that ran that day, not from melted snow. The weevils in the flour had gotten bad enough that men refused porridge and went for harder meat. A guard on the west tower went down with a fever, and the man who replaced him did not know the signal they had set. Outside, Howland Reed's people moved on the marsh side and made a noise like frogs where frogs had no business being in that season. Inside, a man who had been a blacksmith in the Dreadfort service for 15 years thought of the time he had held his daughter while she shivered from an illness and a Bolton had ridden past their hut without stopping. He put down his hammer and did not pick it up again. He went to a door that had a lock he had made with his own hand and did something to it with a bent nail. That was the hinge on which the day swung. They came in like their ancestors had gone out, through low places and forgotten ones, with knives and with care. The first man to die screamed. They had hoped he would not, but hope is a thing that shows up whether invited or not and then leaves on its own schedule. The second man did not scream because Brynden Tully's hand closed his mouth and then set him down. After that there was less screaming than you'd think, because some men decided not to and some men did not have time and some men did not see their own ends coming. Robb went where the bolts were thickest because that was where a crown belongs. Grey wind moved through the corridors like a winter river, unstoppable where the ground is true and cunning where it is not. So few men had ever seen a dire wolf in a hall. Most froze, and freezing is death's brother. Roose Bolton fought without rage and without any waste. He did not shout. He did not curse. He put his blade where it did the most good for him and the most bad for his foe. He saw the shape of the day sooner than anyone and adjusted to it. That was his best quality and his worst. He fought his way toward a bolt hole and found it stuck. He turned to take another route and found men he did not know had names set to meet him because someone had studied his maps, which were like his letters, precise and therefore predictable. He took a cut to the thigh that would have hamstrung a clumsier man and did not fall because he was not clumsy. He took a knife in the arm from a girl who had come with the rills and who had hidden in a barrel and gotten very still. He killed her with a soft sound that made Robb's stomach turn. He did not get out. They took him alive for as long as it took to say the words justice required. He said little. He did not ask for anything. He did not spit. Women drew water without looking over their shoulder. The letters that came from the south were fewer and less sure of themselves. Walder Frey wrote to Robb and offered an apology made of words that had no bones. Robb put it in a drawer and then later used it to light a fire without looking at it again. Tywin Lannister died in his own bed with his mouth set. After, the world that had taken its rhythm from the way he tapped a finger on would had to make a new rhythm, and men in the north felt the pause like a change in weather that reaches across mountains. Robb's hand found work even in the quiet. He set men to making roads they could find under snow with their feet. He ordered smiths to build shoes for horses that would not cut legs when ice turned a path to glass. He sent letters to the wall with men who knew how to keep a raven alive in a cold sky. He wrote to his sister at the Vale, though he did not know for certain where she was. He wrote the kind of letter that would look like nothing to the wrong eyes and everything to the right ones, naming a hill they had climbed when they were children and a set of steps she had once fallen from, and the time she had brought him a sweet at supper because she had thought him brave, and then he had cried because he had been afraid of a beetle. He wrote to Arya, who was Wind, and he put the letter under his pillow for one night like a charm because he had no other place to send it. Jane grew round with child in a season when it was hard to be certain what one should wish for. Catelyn watched her with the guarded tenderness of a woman who has learned that her heart will be asked to hold more than anyone should be made to hold and will be given no choice in the holding. Robb sat with his wife in the evenings when he could, with his boots muddy and his hair damp and his hands smelling of iron despite washing. They spoke of small things sometimes because small things make a net that holds you when the larger ones break. The taste of the stew, the way the snow packed under your heel on the west steps, the way the maester's raven had picked at a ring on the window until it had pulled it loose and then had flown off shining. Other nights they spoke of birth and of names and of how a father's hand should fit around a head so soft. Asha came and went, quick as wind off a cliff, and their talk when they found a handful of hours was the talk of conspirators and of comrades and of two people who understood they were not like other people. She told him Euron had taken prizes in the Reach and given out dreams like sweets, and that he had tired of the taste of Lannisport for now. He had chewed on it hard and found less meat than he had wanted. "His eye is bigger than his stomach," she said dryly. "I am trying to make sure my folk eat between his feasts. He will not care if we starve so long as he drinks." "You will be queen of a kind," Robb said. She made a face. "I am captain enough. If I spend my days in a chair I will grow barnacles. Best to move." "Best," he agreed. "And if you should ever choose to bring your men to my east coast with their swords sheathed and their bellies empty, I will feed them if I have food to feed my own and turn away no man who comes under the peace we named." "You are a better man than most think kings are," she said, which was equal parts compliment and insult in her mouth, and he took it as either, laughing. When spring finally thought about shouldering its way into the world, men noticed in small ways. A bucket of water that did not skin over before dawn, a bird that sang as if it had had practice, a patch of earth on a south-facing slope that turned to mud and then to the smell that only comes once a year, a smell like everything dead thinking about being alive again. Robb watched men blink at that smell like dogs and then smile without meaning to. He thought of his father walking grounds and saying nothing because there was nothing to say, not because there was much. The child came into that season when the earth's breath had only begun to warm. Jane labored as women have always done, with courage and with fear and with a strength that would have shamed half the knights who wore steel outside their bodies. Catelyn held her hand and told her stories of the Riverlands that were not meant to be heard by men. Robb stood outside the door and counted his own breaths like a fool and then laughed at himself because he could not do anything but count. He promised himself, silently and with the kind of iron he had come to trust, that if the gods took one they could not have both. He did not say it to the gods. He said it to himself, which is sometimes the stronger vow. The babe was a boy with a voice that got stronger with every breath, as if he were learning to be in this world rapidly for fear it might change between wails. He had hair like the sheared end of a storm cloud and a scowl when he made water. Robb put his hand under the small warm weight and felt something in him loosen that had been clenched since the river had breathed under Riverrun in another life. He looked at Catelyn over the tiny face and found her face a poem of lines he had learned to read too well and still did not understand, and in it was joy like a clear drink. They named him Eddard because there are debts you pay gladly. That night, when the hall had eaten and drunk and laughed and the harp had had enough and been put away, Robb found himself alone with the child in the solar while Jane slept and Catelyn, exhausted and light as a blown leaf, rested near. The candles guttered and steadied. The baby snuffled and sighed and made fists and relaxed them as if practicing letting go. Robb spoke to him because men who are afraid and in love speak to small things. "You will not know half of what made you possible," he said quietly. "That is fine. You will know the things ahead of you. That will do. You will be told stories of men who made war and men who made peace and men who made bad bargains and good ones. You can decide which were which better than we can. Just remember that your father tried to count food before banners. If that keeps you safe, I have done all I can." Grey Wind sighed like a bellows from where he lay and put his muzzle on the baby's feet with a care that would have awakened laughter if anyone else had been there to see. Robb smiled and then looked out the window where night was a slow, clean wool. Somewhere in that dark was a boy with a cap of poor felt and thread sewn crooked. Somewhere a girl with a sword and a list. Somewhere a sister whose heart had been bruised into cunning. Somewhere a brother who spoke to trees and ravens. Somewhere, on a shore that threw foam onto rocks, a woman counted men and lights and told herself a joke because no one else would. When trouble came again, as it must, it did not look like it had before. News ran like a thin creek made faster by spring. A girl had hatched dragons, or perhaps a woman had. A city of books had burned and then not burned because men argued in ink afterward. A king in the south had been choked by wine while 1,000 eyes watched, and they all told different stories about the color his face had turned. These were not Robb's battles, not yet. His was a tally of granaries and oaths and disputes about a strip of land where a fence had been moved in snow and the memory of where it had been before had gone with it. He found that he liked these battles better, which made his captain smile and call him a steward. He took the name without offense. "A king should be the best steward," he told them. "If he is not, he ought to find someone better and kneel to him." Spring ran on legs that grew stronger. Davos came north again with salt in his hair and a grin that had a tooth gap he had not had before. It made him look less respectable and more like the man he had been. With him came a boy whose hair was too long and whose eyes were like knives left in a drawer too long and not yet rusted. Rickon stank and would not be bathed until he saw Grey Wind, and then he laughed so loud men in the yard turned and the sound turned them younger for a heartbeat. He threw his arms around the wolf's neck and Grey Wind huffed and rolled. And when Rickon stood he looked around the yard as if daring anyone to tell him he did not own it. Osha stood beside him with a spear and a grin like a scar and a hand that never went far from the boy's shoulder. Catelyn made a sound Robb had never heard before and will never forget. A sound like a branch breaking under snow and spring both. She went to her son and did not say anything until she had put her hands on his face and put her nose to his hair and breathed him like bread. Then she said his name and he rolled his eyes at her as boys do and then smiled because mothers do that to boys and they cannot help loving them for it. The hall that night was a thing that would have made a southern court sneer. The meats were not as fine as any at King's Landing had been. The harpist missed 3 notes in a row. The benches were rough. It was more beautiful than anything in the south. Men cried when they did not mean to. A woman laughed so hard she had to clutch her belly and then she laughed more at herself. The boy ate like a wolf and then fell asleep at the table with a crust in his hand, and everyone who looked at him softened in the way that comes when fate has been too busy to give you back something and suddenly remembers. The next morning he woke wild and got into 2 fights before noon. One with a boy who had looked at him sideways and one with a dog that had decided to test his boldness. He won both at cost. Osha told him not to be a fool and then let him be one a little because boys become men by losing skin over their knuckles. Bran's news did not come in the way of boys on boats or men with letters. Came like weather. A raven sat on the heart tree's branch and croaked in a pattern that made the hair on Robb's neck lift. It stayed 3 days and then went. In that time Robb went to the gods wood each day and spoke out loud to the bark as if it were flesh and the ear of a brother lay under it. He told this brother of bread, and of wolves, and of babies, and of knives, and of the way men will look at you sometimes with complete trust and how that scrapes skin off a place in you had not known had skin. He did not ask for anything except once, when he said into the leaves, "Be warm if you can," and thought himself a fool for measuring love with the weather. The south kept its own storms. A letter came with a strip of silk tucked into it that smelled of some flower that does not grow anywhere cold. It spoke of a young woman with hair like spilled ink and dragons that were like no creature men had known. It said she wanted to come home, though she had never been there. Robb read it and passed it to Catelyn, and she read it and passed it to Brynden, and he passed it to Manderly, who could not help himself. And the fat lord read it and licked his lips and said, "If she comes to my harbor with a dozen cogs of grain and a notion to be polite, I will call her my liege for as long as it takes her to eat a pie." The hall roared. Later, when the noise had died, Manderly leaned forward and said in a voice that reached only the table, "If she comes with dragons and no food, we will call her something else." The veil stayed quiet, as it does, and threw stones down on men who climbed its paths. The riverlands bled slowly and then scabbed, and in between the blackfish grew older and leaned less on jokes and more on that habit he had of being exactly where a spear was going to be needed. Edmure got a son with Rosalind at last, in a moment that made even bitter phrase admit that sometimes a woman's smile is a better victory than a sack of coins. Not all. Some of them cursed in their cups and went on cursing, because if you have practiced a thing too long, the mouth does it without calling you. Walder Frey outlived most of the men who might have killed him out of rage. He did not outlive all. One night a man who had been a stable boy at the Twins and had carried salt to tables when he was 12 and had watched a singer bleed on his boots when some cousin had tired of his song came to the old lord's bed with a blade and no words. He did the work quickly and made sure of it, then walked out and into the river. His wife cried on a step and then stopped and never spoke of him again. Legend made more of it than there was. It always does. The nights grew shorter again. The sun found courage. In that light Theon walked the walls, sometimes with a guard who liked him and a guard who did not, and a woman named Ragna who liked to tell him stories of the rills that made him laugh until he remembered he could. He fed a dog in the yard with his own hand and did not flinch when it licked his fingers. Asha came and looked at him with a captain's measuring eye and a sister's careful love and said, "You are uglier than you were and better." He said, "I am more." And she barked a laugh and clapped him on the shoulder and told him she had a place for him on a deck if he ever remembered how to stand with his sea legs and did not mind men calling him names. He said he might, one day. In the saying was the first step out of a shadow that had clung like a second skin. He went to the Godswood without fear one morning and put his hand on the tree and did not ask for anything. They lit the watchtowers along the eastern coast the night the first of Euron's captains came north without Asha's leave and put a reaver's toe on the wrong side of a line drawn with bread and blood. The light went from tower to tower like water poured from one jug into others, and the longship swung its prow away with haste because men in those towers had slings strong as truth and stones that remembered the shape of a forehead. The captain spat in the sea and told the men at his oars to row south. Later he told men in a tavern that he would have raided that day if not for a wind that had turned at the last moment. Asha heard of it in a hall with a smoke-blackened beam and spat into the fire and said, "He will do worse. Keep your lights trimmed." The year after, Robb went south with a small party to stand at the Trident and look at the place where the world had been made and unmade for his father and the men around him. He took Brynden and a handful of guards and no banners that would keep company with ghosts. He stood in water that had been red once and was only water now. He thought of boys with heads full of dreams and men with heads full of plans and the river running past them all with the same indifference. He knelt and put his hand in, and the cold bit him to the bone, and he took it out and laughed for no reason he could name except the one the river gives. Because laughing reminds the body it is alive. He came home to find his son trying to drink from a cup that was too big for his hands and too heavy. Eddard would not let go and he would not spill and he would not let anyone help him, and then the cup tipped and he went down with it and roared as if the defeat were the worst thing the world had ever done to him. Robb scooped him and the cup and a handful of cloths and soothed and scolded and kissed and made all the small noises fathers learned to make and no one records. Jane laughed in the doorway and said, "That is your face when you read a letter from the Freys." And he said, "I am more handsome." And she said, "You are wrong." And they went on in the way of people whose days are not easy and not terrible and mostly good. There was always a shadow north of north. The wall breathed cold. Ravens went and came with their black indifference. Letters spoke of things men did not write while sober. Stannis marshaled and moved, and the watch put one foot in front of the other for no pay and no praise. A winter night a light walked the trees beyond the last farms, and men went inside and barred doors, because even brave men bar doors against what they cannot name. Robb kept sending bread and men and those small kindnesses that make a watch worth standing. He sent letters that said only, "We see you." When the next war came, it would perhaps be not of men against men, but of men against a thing that did not care for men at all. Robb knew this because he had listened to old stories when he was a boy, and because he had learned to hear the tone of a letter that has been written while looking at whiter things than paper. He did not gird his realm with dragons or speeches. He put shoes on horses and made sure the larders were full and that the roads were clear, and he spoke to his people in words they could carry in their pockets. He slept with a knife where he could reach it and a child where he could not. On a day like any other, he stood on the steps of Winterfell and watched Asha's banner dip on the horizon where a bluff showed itself above the trees. She came up the road with 4 men and a grin on one side of her mouth only, the kind of grin you wear when you have lost and won both and like the taste of neither. She threw a fish at his feet. It had been smoked and it was tied with a blue thread. "From a man who still thinks himself a king," she said. "Not my father, a different one. He wants you to know he dreams of your women and your gold." "He can have neither," Robb said. "He may dream as much as he likes. Dreams make men do stupid things," Asha said. "Guard your east. I will hold mine. If he throws a spear, it may point 2 ways." "He will learn that there are places where spears break," Robb said. "Men learned that," she shrugged. "He is more storm than man some days. It is hard to teach weather. Still, one keeps a roof in good repair." The day that ended as days do. The smoke from the kitchen drifted blue. A boy ran full tilt and skidded and turned the skid into a dance because he had known he would be scolded if he fell. A woman pulled a shawl around her shoulders and thought of her own mother and then shook off the thought because soup was better hot. The heart tree stood and bled and did not speak because it did not need to. It watched as it had always watched, with patience that was not human and kindness that might have been. Robb went, as he often did, to the godswood at the end of the day. He stood there until the snow in last drifts began to weep and the damp got through his boots, and he remembered he had limbs that needed fire. He said his father's name and his brothers and his sisters, and the names of his sons and the sons of men he had seen die, and the names of girls who had grown out of the sight of men and learned to throw knives in courtyards without anyone teaching them. He meant the litany. He did not ask for victory or mercy or time. He asked the tree to keep watching. It always had. He turned and went back into the castle where his people were, and for a time that was longer than anyone had thought possible, when the river had breathed under Riverrun that first gray morning, the world held. And when it shifted, as worlds do, it did not crack only. It also flexed. It turned its face toward a better fire. It remembered what bread was, and that sharing it tastes like something, almost always. The Ironborn who had learned a truce learned also that raiding costs more than it paid when the harbors you had once looted fed you in winter. The riverlands healed as scars do, ugly in places, proud in others. The North went on being the North, which was no small feat. Men told stories in the yard at dusk, and the stories featured wolves and krakens and a king who made a bargain that other men called shame until those men needed to borrow grain and words and found the shame had turned to wisdom while they had not been watching. Children learned their letters again and scratched them on rooftops with soot when nobody was looking, because letters make shapes that are pleasing even when you cannot read them. Women watched their boys grow too wild and smiled, and then told them to sit down and recite the names of the houses back 4 generations. Men still died for stupid reasons and good ones both, and mourners still said the same things and meant them. The world did not become a song. It became a place to live. Gray Wind grew old in the way wolves do when they are allowed to. He did not go gray so much as more itself, as if the idea of wolf had come out in him over the years. He slept more and still outran any hound when he chose. One morning he woke stiff and put his head on Robb's knee for longer than usual and sighed, and Robb sat with him until it grew light, and when it was full day Gray Wind closed his eyes and was gone. Robb buried him with his own hands in the godswood, under a white root that had pushed itself out where it ought not to be. The boy, Eddard, watched without crying because he had decided he was too old for that. Later, he cried into his mother's skirt because he had decided he was still young enough. Robb wept into his sleeves and did not hide it, because some things you do not hide if you mean to teach sons how to be men. Time made its round. The letters kept coming. A claim from a Southron lord about a boundary. A wedding invitation from a house that wanted to boast that they had meat enough to feed a whole hall. A demand from a merchant about a debt he said the old Stark had owed him for a cartload of tar. The tar might have been used to seal a roof that no longer leaked. The cart had broken. The merchant wanted coin. Robb paid him out of the treasury, and then made certain the boy with the hairlip who had helped take Ramsay learn to keep accounts for a storehouse, because men who have eaten hunger do not always know how to count abundance. That is a skill also. Sansa sent a letter that winter with writing neat as she had always made it, and with a tone Robb had not heard before. It said very simply that she was safe, and that the world had become more complicated and then simpler again, and that she had learned to make choices that no one had ever told her a girl would have to make, and that she had made them as best she could. It had a pressed sprig of a little white flower in it, crushed but still smelling faintly of mountain. Robb held it to his nose and breathed, and then put it into a book on the shelf. He did not show it to anyone. He did not have to. He felt the knowledge of it settle over him as calm as sleep. Arya did not send letters. She sent a coin once, in a little pouch with no note. It was a small thing, thin, old. On one side was a face that seemed to change depending on how you looked at it. On the other side was nothing much at all. Robb turned it over and over, and when he did, he felt the sensation a man gets when he stands in a place he remembers from childhood and cannot tell at first what has changed. He gave the coin to Catelyn, and she held it and said softly, "She is a wind we taught to blow," and put it in a drawer with a ribbon from Arya's hair when she had been a little girl and liked to put ribbons on anything that would hold them. Bran's voice never came as words. It came as dreams in which the world bent in directions that were not possible when the sun was up. Robb dreamed once of a great tree that had grown through stone and then through a sky and then through something else altogether. He put his hand on it in the dream and woke with his palm tingling. He did not tell this to anyone except perhaps the weirwood, and the weirwood told no one, which was the weirwood's way. The day a messenger came from the wall with a face bitten raw by wind and a tale about a fight with something that did not bleed right, and men who had stood in a ring and pushed together and refused to think about anything but the coal of their own breath. Robb called his men again. He would do it until he died. He put on his cloak and took his sword and told his son to mind his mother and said to Jane, "It is not over." Jane kissed him and said, "It is never over," and did not make the mistake of saying "come back." She said instead, "Remember to eat, because some spells are in bread, and men forget that when they go chasing stories." Catelyn touched his cheek and looked into his face, and in her eyes was the knowledge she had made peace with. That being a mother is a thing you do without guarantee, and you do it anyway. He went out under a sky rubbed thin with cold. He went out with men he trusted and men he did not, and men who would become either. He went out with a wolf carved into the hilt of his sword, and a boy with his name behind him, and a woman who had learned to fight at his side, and a gray old fish who had made jokes in rivers since before he had been born. He went out into a world that had become more itself since the day on the strand when a woman smelling of salt had held out her hand and he had taken it. He went out to do the things men remember and the things they do not, which are sometimes more important. The river breathed under ice. The sea threw itself at rock and withdrew. The trees stood where they had always stood and watched with eyes only the gods understand. And the story, which had been made of bargains and iron and work and hurt and bread and births and wolves, went on.